In the golden hush of early morning, a young woman laced up her running shoes and stepped into the familiar embrace of Napa Valley's winding trails. It was a route she knew intimately, a peaceful haven carved through chaparral and oak, where the air carried the earthy perfume of dry grass, sun-warmed soil, and the delicate sweetness of nearby vineyards. Veronica Hensley set off with the determined stride of someone who belonged to the path beneath her feet. She never returned. Her car remained parked just off the trailhead, untouched. No signs of disturbance, no clues to suggest what had happened. For nearly 2 years, her sudden disappearance hung like a heavy fog over the region, leaving her loved ones in an agonizing limbo, haunted by questions that refused to yield answers. The silence was merciless, but in an astonishing twist, it would be a retired chef's truffle pig, of all things, that uncovered the first real trace of the truth. The pig's frantic digging at an isolated, rarely traversed section of forest would change everything. September in Napa carries a kind of magic and melancholy. The light slants differently in those days before fall, casting long shadows across golden hills. The air is dry but rich, textured by the mingling of crushed sagebrush, wild rosemary, and the heady aroma of grapes nearing harvest. For the locals, this isn't just a postcard-perfect wine country. It's their playground, their backyard, and their spiritual refuge. Hikers, cyclists, and runners weave through the terrain on a web of rustic trails that meander through low valleys and snake up into ridgelines dusted in chaparral. These routes offer both challenge and peace, a physical release and a mental reset. Veronica was part of this ecosystem, a well-known figure in the community whose presence was as natural as the trails themselves. At 28, she was the embodiment of discipline and vitality. Her profession as a physical therapist shaped not only her career, but her approach to life. She knew the human body in intimate detail, its strength, its fragility, and its immense potential when pushed with care. That knowledge informed her training as a long-distance runner. Her blonde ponytail bobbed in rhythm with her stride, a blur of energy that others came to recognize as a regular fixture along the trails. To those who knew her, she was more than just an athlete. Veronica radiated warmth and strength in equal measure. She could sit in silence with a friend or light up a room with her laughter. Her boyfriend, David Chen, shared her love for the outdoors. A thoughtful software engineer with a calm demeanor, David was drawn to her resilience and her kindness. On Tuesday, September 15th, 2020, the two set out for an afternoon jog on the Channel Trail, known colloquially as CH/NH. Locals cherished it for its scenic beauty and moderate incline, ideal for endurance training. As they jogged side by side, the trail's familiar bends unfolded before them. The sun filtered through the trees, dappling their skin in shifting patterns of light and shadow. At a spot marked by an old wooden signpost, weathered but sturdy, they paused to catch their breath. The sign bore the etched letters CH/NH and the number 500 beneath it. David took out his phone, wanting to hold on to the moment. Veronica leaned casually against the post, her water bottle in hand, the color high in her cheeks from the exertion. She smiled, a true, unguarded smile. He snapped the photo, unknowingly capturing the last image that anyone would take of her. Their rhythm as a couple was well rehearsed. David had a conference scheduled the following morning in Sacramento. It was a 2-day engagement, mandatory, but routine. Before the sun rose on Wednesday, September 16th, he slipped out of their apartment with a quiet kiss goodbye. The lamp in their bedroom cast a faint glow as he whispered that he'd call her later. He couldn't have imagined that her voice, so familiar and grounding, would never greet him again. The hotel in Sacramento was the antithesis of the life he'd left behind that morning. Beige walls, artificial light, the sterile hum of air conditioning. David sat through keynote speakers and panel discussions, but his mind wandered often, returning to Veronica's face, to the trails, to the way her fingers had brushed his when they ran side by side. By 7 p.m., he was back in his hotel room, the day's obligations behind him. He loosened his tie, sat on the edge of the bed, and dialed her number, straight to voicemail. That was unlike her, but not alarming. Not yet. He imagined a dead battery, or that she had left her phone at home while out for a walk. He sent a casual message. "Hey, hope you had a good day. Call me when you get this." He ordered dinner. He half-watched a sitcom. An hour later, he tried again. Still no answer. That's when the subtle worry began to take form, cold and creeping. Veronica wasn't careless. She lived with intention, her life planned down to the smallest detail. Their nightly calls weren't just habit, they were ritual. At 9:30, he texted again. More pointed this time. Getting a little worried. "Everything okay?" No reply, not even the 3 blinking dots that would signal she was typing back. The absence was thunderous. The longer the silence stretched, the more oppressive it became. By 10 p.m., the anxiety had taken hold. He called Sarah, Veronica's best friend. "Hey, sorry to call so late," he began, trying to sound calm. "Have you heard from Veronica today?" Sarah's voice changed immediately. "No, I haven't. I thought it was weird she didn't text me back earlier. She always calls." That confirmation was like a plunge into icy water. The excuses David had rehearsed, forgotten phone, bad signal. Maybe she was just tired, collapsed all at once. This wasn't a one-off. She was missing. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he paced the confines of his hotel room, calling her again and again, each time praying for her voice. The automated message, her voicemail greeting, played like a cruel recording. He started over every half hour, hoping something had changed, but the silence remained. When the sun finally rose over Sacramento on Thursday, September 17th, it did not bring clarity, only a terrible certainty. Something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. With dawn barely cresting over the hills, David Chen checked out of the Sacramento hotel, the morning stillness in stark contrast to the turmoil roiling inside him. The drive back to Napa was a blur of winding asphalt and gnawing dread. His thoughts spiraled, every mile stretching the distance between hope and the grim reality he was now beginning to face. Clutching the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, he finally made a decision. His voice trembled as he dialed 911, each ring tightening the coil in his chest. "I'm reporting a missing person," he told the dispatcher, his words catching in his throat. "Her name is Veronica Hensley, my girlfriend. She never came home yesterday." He then laid out the details with aching precision. Her routines, her dedication, her dependability. She always ran on the CH/NH trail system when not working at the clinic. Always alone. She would have left the apartment around 8 a.m. on Wednesday morning. Without fail, she was home by 10. The dispatcher, calm and composed as protocol dictated, listened patiently, asking the necessary questions, recording each one of David's answers into a growing report. She reassured him that deputies were already being dispatched to the trailhead. Her professional calm didn't comfort him. The gravity in her voice only deepened the sense of urgency already weighing him down. By the time David arrived, the familiar serenity of the trailhead had been disrupted by the unmistakable signs of an unfolding investigation. 2 black and white patrol cars stood sentinel near the entrance, their lights off, but their presence urgent. Bright yellow crime scene tape stretched between metal poles and tree trunks, slicing through the otherwise peaceful natural setting like a scar. Tucked at the far edge of the gravel lot sat Veronica's silver sedan. It was locked, untouched. The faint sheen of dust on its exterior suggested it hadn't moved in over a day. Through the car windows, David could see a half-consumed water bottle in the center console and her sunglasses resting neatly on the passenger seat. There was no sign of chaos, no forced entry. Everything was just as it would have been on any ordinary morning. Except this morning was not ordinary. Veronica had never returned. The car was a ghostly placeholder, a grim confirmation that she had made it to the trail, had begun her usual run. Somewhere in the sun-soaked expanse of wilderness beyond, she had simply disappeared. The response from the Napa County Sheriff's Office was immediate and methodical. The once welcoming gateway to the wilderness was now a base of operations. Deputies cordoned off a wide perimeter around the trailhead. Yellow tape fluttered in the warm breeze, a jarring contrast against the tranquil browns and greens of the landscape. The first deputies moved deliberately, their expressions grim but focused, trained for this kind of situation, yet always hoping it would end differently. They photographed Veronica's vehicle from multiple angles, noting the layer of dust as an indicator of elapsed time. Each detail inside the car, the sunglasses, the water bottle, a spare hair tie tucked into the gear shift, took on an eerie new meaning. These were no longer mundane items. They were now relics of an interrupted life. A small team of deputies fanned out to perform an initial search of the area. They scanned the first 100 yards of the CH/NH trail with a meticulous eye, moving slowly, combing the ground, studying the low-hanging branches and dense underbrush for any trace. A scuff mark, a piece of clothing, a dropped item, anything that might speak to what had happened. But the forest was silent, indifferent. No signs of distress, no broken twigs, no disturbed soil. It was as if she had stepped into the trees and vanished without a sound. The weight of the park's vastness loomed over them. The realization was sobering. This wouldn't be resolved with a quick search and a hopeful call. This would take manpower, coordination, and time. By noon, reinforcements began to arrive. White utility trucks and marked vans rolled into the dusty parking lot, each bearing the insignia of the Napa County Search and Rescue, USAR, Division. Volunteers from all walks of life emerged from the vehicles. Some were teachers, others electricians. Several retirees who had made rescuing the lost their mission in life. Some had been doing this for decades. The leader of the operation, Frank Hewitt, stepped into view. His deeply lined face shaded beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his eyes steely with experience. Frank laid out a large topographical map on a collapsible table beneath a broad oak tree. The map showed the complex, unforgiving terrain they were about to enter. Contour lines swirled like a puzzle of ridges, ravines, and hidden paths. Some trails were official. Others were little more than foot-worn suggestions carved by time and repetition. Frank used a red grease pencil to mark zones, sketching potential routes Veronica could have taken and dividing the terrain into sectors. Assignments were handed out quickly, radios distributed, and every team briefed. David remained close by, a pale shadow to the flurry of activity. He answered questions as best as he could. Veronica's running habits, the gear she carried, her physical condition. She was healthy, strong, and disciplined. She wouldn't have veered off trail without reason. Still, his eyes kept drifting toward the entrance of the trail, the dark slit in the trees that had swallowed her up. The methodical organization around him felt dwarfed by the immense, terrifying silence. As the ground teams readied themselves, the K-9 unit arrived. At the center of that team was Ranger, a muscular German shepherd with a gleaming coat and sharp, intelligent eyes. His handler, Maria, a quiet, composed woman in her early 40s, approached Veronica's car and opened the driver's side door. Ranger jumped up eagerly, sniffing deeply inside the vehicle. He caught her scent immediately. With a sharp bark, he signaled. Maria clipped on his lead, issued the command, and he took off at a focused trot toward the trailhead. The search team followed, hope momentarily rekindled by the dog's confident demeanor. For the first mile, Ranger was unstoppable. He followed the main trail with unerring precision, his body taut with purpose, tail raised like a flag. The volunteers behind him exchanged glances, optimism quietly rising. This was how it was supposed to go. The scent had been picked up. The trail was warm. A resolution might be within reach. But then they came to a junction. The primary path continued straight ahead, but another veered left. A smaller, narrower trail, barely noticeable unless you knew it was there. It dipped into a shaded creek bed, lined with thick brush and shaded by towering oaks. Ranger paused. He stood at the fork, his body rigid. His nose worked frantically, sweeping left, then right, then left again. He whined, barked once, sharp and uncertain. The scent had changed. Something was off. The confidence that had carried the searchers began to waver. Ranger hesitated at the fork in the trail, his momentum halted by a sudden, invisible wall. He sniffed the air in both directions, his body tensed, tail dropping slightly. With a low, frustrated whine, he took a tentative few steps down the narrower left-hand path, then circled back, retracing his steps, nose pressed low to the ground in desperate repetition. The confidence that had propelled him forward was gone, replaced by confusion and agitation. Maria watched closely, knowing what it meant. She tried again, encouraging him to recast the scent. "Find her, boy. Where is she?" But the dog only paced in widening loops, glancing back at her as if pleading for direction. The scent, so strong and certain just moments before, had dissipated completely, lost to the dry air and the layered time that had already begun to erode the trail. It was as if Veronica had vanished into the ether, plucked from the very earth without a single trace to show the way she had gone. The first real surge of hope had evaporated, leaving behind the gnawing weight of uncertainty once again. The trail had gone cold. Back at the makeshift command post, tension thickened. Detectives continued to interview the handful of hikers who had been in the area the previous morning. Most reported uneventful treks, peaceful scenery, no unusual encounters. But then, a quiet stir rippled through the perimeter as an elderly couple approached a deputy. The Hendersons, longtime residents and familiar faces to some in the community, looked visibly unsettled. Their voices trembled as they described what they had seen. At around 11 a.m. on Wednesday, while descending the Lower Ridge Trail roughly 3 miles away, they witnessed something that had lingered in their minds all day. They had spotted a young blonde woman, her features unclear at a distance, locked in what looked like a heated confrontation with a man. He stood next to a dusty dark blue pickup truck parked at a remote spur of the trailhead. The man's body language was aggressive, his gestures sharp. The woman, they said, appeared upset, though they couldn't make out the words exchanged. The image had unsettled them, and now, learning of Veronica's disappearance, it took on a chilling relevance. Detective Bill Sutton, the lead on the case, listened carefully. The timeline didn't perfectly align, and the location was somewhat removed from the CH/NH system. But in a sea of unknowns, this was a concrete sighting. A narrative had emerged, fragmentary, but tangible. A woman fitting Veronica's description, an argument, a truck, and an unidentified man. Sutton weighed the lead carefully, but with little else to pursue, it became the investigation's new North Star. An all-points bulletin went out for the blue pickup. Patrol units were directed to scour the rural roads in every direction. Meanwhile, a dedicated team was sent to canvass the Lower Ridge Trail area, searching for any trace of the man or his vehicle. The command post buzzed with redirected energy, radios crackling with new assignments and updated search zones. For the next 6 hours, much of the operation pivoted toward this potential breakthrough. Hopes lifted. Maybe, just maybe, they had found the missing piece. But as the hours wore on with no sightings, no evidence, and no sign of the man or truck, the initial rush gave way to disillusionment. The couple's account, though sincere, had led them down a dead end. No vehicle was found, no further witnesses came forward, and the individuals seen by the Hendersons were never identified. Another promising lead dissolved into the dust, leaving behind a growing sense of desperation and the bitter aftertaste of time lost. As search efforts on the ground faltered, the team turned to the skies. A helicopter from the California Highway Patrol hovered above the park, its rotor blades thudding rhythmically, the sound echoing like a heartbeat through the canyons and hills. The aerial observer, strapped securely in his seat, scanned the sprawling terrain through powerful binoculars. From this vantage point, the scale of the wilderness became even more daunting. Below him stretched an ocean of green and brown oak trees, brush, and jagged rock outcroppings, creating an endless, undulating tapestry. The trails appeared as faint threads winding through the landscape, barely perceptible beneath the thick canopy. He spotted wildlife, deer darting between trees, a fox slipping into shadow, but no sign of human presence, no flash of bright running gear, no movement out of place. Nothing. On the ground, drone pilots worked tirelessly to cover the gaps where the chopper couldn't reach. Drones swept over ridges, down into narrow gullies, and through thickets too dense for foot searchers. Their high-resolution cameras relayed real-time footage back to command monitors, where searchers squinted at screens for hours, combing every pixel for anomalies. But the drones, for all their technological prowess, were subject to the forest's will. Trees formed walls, shadows formed hiding places, and the forest floor remained hidden beneath a stubborn veil. What the drones captured was exactly what nature allowed them to see. Nothing more, and certainly nothing useful. On the fourth day, a spark broke the monotony of loss and repetition, not from technology or law enforcement, but from a volunteer. His name was Leo, a college sophomore home for summer break. Eager to help, he had been assigned to one of the brush clearing teams tasked with covering the roughest, most overgrown areas. His sector was far from the main trail, in the direction where Ranger had faltered. The terrain was brutal, slopes choked with manzanita, thorny underbrush clawing at every step. Progress was slow, grueling, but Leo pressed forward, using a machete to carve a path through the tangled growth. As he pushed aside a particularly dense branch, his eyes locked on something that didn't belong. A streak of pink, almost fluorescent, caught in the thorns just inches from the ground. His heart pounded. Dropping to his knees, he carefully reached out and retrieved the object. A single, vividly colored shoelace, untangled, unsoiled, and unmistakably new. He didn't hesitate. "Command, this is Team 7, he called into his radio. "I found something. Pink shoelace, matches the description." Back at base, the energy shifted in an instant. David had provided photos of Veronica's running shoes, bright pink Hokas with custom laces she'd picked out months before. The match was exact. Within the hour, the hillside around Leo's find was swarming with searchers. They established a tight new grid and began a meticulous, inch-by-inch inspection. They cleared brush, sifted through leaves, and marked every indentation in the soil. The work was painstaking. Hope surged again, brittle but undeniable. Yet as the hours dragged on, nothing else emerged. No clothing, no gear, no signs of a body. The forest remained maddeningly mute. The shoelace was both a revelation and a torment. It confirmed Veronica had been there, but it raised more questions than it answered. Why was she so far from her usual path? Had she fled? Had she been taken? Had she stumbled here in distress? The single piece of evidence stood alone, a beacon of uncertainty in a landscape that swallowed truth. As the days dragged on, the scope of the investigation shifted. Detectives, as they often do in such cases, turned their gaze inward. David, once the grieving boyfriend, was now also a potential source of inconsistencies. He was invited to the sheriff's station, where he sat in a small, quiet room across from two investigators. The questions came softly but methodically. "Tell us again about Sacramento. When did you leave? Who did you see? Where were you at noon? Where did you stop for gas? What time did you check into the hotel? Can you confirm who you spoke with at the conference?" The questions came in steady succession, each one peeling back layers of David Chen's movements in a methodical effort to verify his alibi. Hollowed out from days without sleep, eyes red-rimmed and sunken, David answered each one with weary precision. His voice was flat, almost robotic, but beneath it simmered the flicker of frustration, an unspoken anguish that he, of all people, was under the microscope. While David sat in that stark interview room, recounting his trip to Sacramento down to the smallest detail, another group of detectives was already in the field, doing the painstaking work of confirming or disproving his every word. His credit card purchases were the first breadcrumb. A time-stamped transaction at a Starbucks just off Interstate 80 verified his presence in the area early Wednesday morning. Next came surveillance footage from the hotel lobby, grainy but clear. It captured him checking in just as he had described at precisely the time he had said. Cell phone records were subpoenaed, and the tower pings painted a definitive picture. His phone had remained within Sacramento's bounds for the entire window of Veronica's disappearance, never veering off the expected route. From the highway corridor to his hotel and back again, the digital trail was irrefutable. When the lead detective sat across from him and delivered the news that he was officially cleared, it should have brought some measure of comfort. But it didn't. Instead, David felt the weight of dread grow heavier. If he wasn't responsible, then someone else was, an unknown figure, lurking out there with the answers they all desperately sought. That unknown was more terrifying than anything he had imagined. By the second week, the landscape had shifted, not just metaphorically, but physically. The relentless heat of the Napa sun had baked the earth to a crust. Winds swept across the region, erasing the fine, telltale marks left behind by hikers, animals, or perhaps a desperate runner. 50 square miles of rugged terrain had been combed, every ravine, ridge, and thicket scoured by boots on the ground and eyes in the sky. The volunteers, many of whom had sacrificed their own lives and jobs to assist, were fraying. Their dedication was unwavering, but exhaustion now shadowed every step. Hope, once a powerful driver, had begun to give way to resignation. On the morning of September 30th, Frank Hewitt stood before a crowd of reporters, a wall of microphones positioned before him just outside the trailhead. The sky above was clear, the sun already hot, and the air carried the quiet tension of an ending. Frank, the seasoned SAR commander, chose his words carefully. He explained that while the investigation remained open, the large-scale search operation was being scaled down to a limited and continuous status. Behind the procedural language was a brutal truth. The search was ending. The mobile command unit was disassembled. Search grids were folded and filed away. The last yellow strip of police tape was peeled off the trees, and the hum of radios and the whir of helicopters vanished. As the final SAR trucks rolled down the access road and out of sight, David stood with Veronica's sisters at the trail's edge. They listened to the silence that now cloaked the forest, a silence that had once been broken by the hopeful clamor of search efforts. Now it was deafening, a void too vast to fill. The forest had reclaimed its peace, and it had kept its secret. A year passed, long enough for the seasons to cycle, for leaves to fall and bloom again, for grief to shift from rawness to a dull, persistent ache. In that time, the world moved on. News cycles turned, new tragedies emerged. The face that had once appeared daily on television screens, flyers, and community billboards faded from public consciousness. The yellow ribbons tied around trees by volunteers and neighbors began to fray. Eventually, many fell, their fabric breaking down into the earth they once stood on. In the fall of 2021, a year after the official search ended, Veronica Hensley's case was quietly transferred to the cold case files of the Napa County Sheriff's Office. It was a technical move, an administrative acknowledgement that no new leads remained. But for her family, it was a symbolic blow. The thick binder that contained her case, a mosaic of maps, statements, photos, and the singular pink shoelace, was shelved among dozens of others. Each one represented a life cut short or a person lost to the unknown, a puzzle waiting for its missing piece. To the system, Veronica was now a statistic, but for her family, she remained heartbreakingly real. Her younger sister, Jessica, became the anchor around which the family's resolve gathered. A graphic designer by trade, Jessica funneled her grief into a mission. She created a Facebook page, Find Veronica Hensley, as a digital beacon. It quickly grew, attracting a small but passionate group of followers who refused to let the case fade. Jessica posted often. She shared stories of Veronica's childhood, memories of holidays, running events, and quiet afternoons filled with laughter. She reposted the final image David had taken, Veronica leaning against the trail sign, smiling, alive. It became a symbol of what had been lost and what still might be found. Each update was a form of resistance, a refusal to let her sister become just another name on a dusty folder. On the anniversary of Veronica's disappearance, Jessica organized a memorial run at the CH/NH trailhead. Local runners, many of whom had never met Veronica but felt bound to her story, joined in. They ran the first mile of the trail together in silence. Dozens of feet pounded the dust in unison, a moving tribute beneath the whispering trees. At the turnaround point, they returned to the parking lot, gathered, and shared memories. Balloons were released, each one rising into the vast blue sky, carrying with it a message, a prayer, a hope that somewhere, somehow, Veronica might hear them. But even as Jessica fought to keep her sister's name in the light, another version of the story unfolded elsewhere, across the digital back channels of the internet. On Reddit, in true crime forums, on YouTube, and on anonymous message boards, Veronica's disappearance had become a topic of obsession. Armchair investigators pored over maps, timestamps, and aerial footage. Theories emerged and multiplied. Some believed Veronica had suffered a fatal fall, her body obscured by the rugged terrain. Others suggested a wild animal attack, most often a mountain lion, citing the silence at the scene and the lack of evidence. Yet another theory gained traction, the possibility that she had chosen to disappear. To those who embraced this line of thinking, the absence of clues wasn't a dead end. It was the plan. They speculated that Veronica, though outwardly content, had orchestrated her own vanishing. She was fit, intelligent, and well acquainted with the wilderness. Could she have crafted an escape, a new identity, a life lived off-grid? The idea was painful for her family. But even pain carried a cruel kind of comfort, because if she had left by choice, it meant she might still be alive. 18 months after Veronica Hensley vanished into the unforgiving wilderness in the spring of 2022, a chilling encounter shattered the uneasy quiet that had settled over Napa County. It was early morning, still cool, the sun just beginning to filter through the trees, when a young woman in her early 20s set off for her regular jog along a trail about 5 miles from where Veronica had last been seen. She was used to solitude on these paths, the rhythm of her feet, the whisper of the wind in the branches, the occasional call of a bird overhead. This was her sanctuary. But that day something felt off. A nondescript older model sedan had been parked at a small turnout along the trail, its presence unusual for the hour. The man inside remained still, eyes tracking her as she passed, his gaze cold and unwavering. On her return loop, her stomach tightened. The car door was open. The man was now outside, standing near the edge of the path. As she drew closer, he exposed himself, leering in silence before leaping back into his vehicle and speeding off down the winding road. Shaken but unhurt, she ran straight to the nearest ranger station and reported the incident. Her description of the man was vague: average height, dark hair, unremarkable clothing. The car, too, was difficult to pinpoint beyond its model and color. But the details were enough to raise alarms. For the Napa County Sheriff's Office, the memory of Veronica's disappearance was still fresh beneath the surface. The similarities were impossible to ignore. A lone woman, a remote trail, a suspicious man is loitering in an isolated area. It echoed too closely the account from the early days of Veronica's case, the elderly couple who had seen a young blonde woman arguing with a man near a pickup truck. The possibility of a trail predator resurfaced with frightening plausibility. In response, law enforcement ramped up patrols in local parks and along rural trails. Public service announcements went out, urging caution. Flyers were reissued. And, for the first time in over a year, Veronica's file was pulled from cold storage. Detectives reopened the investigation with renewed vigor, re-examining old theories in the light of this new, disturbing report. Could the flasher be the same man responsible for Veronica's disappearance? The idea gained traction quickly. Predators often test boundaries, growing bolder over time. Maybe Veronica had encountered him in the woods. Maybe that brief argument seen by the Hendersons had been the prelude to something far worse. Perhaps now, years later, he was still out there, stalking the quiet edges of Napa's wilderness. The theory was compelling, but the momentum soon stalled. No additional sightings of the man or his vehicle were reported. The woman's description, though earnest, offered no concrete leads. The blue pickup truck from the initial sighting remained an enigma. No license plate, no follow-up tips, no identity. Eventually, despite the flurry of attention, investigators reached a frustrating conclusion. There was no way to link the new incident definitively to Veronica's case. The file was returned to its place on the shelf, a brief flicker of hope extinguished. The darkness crept back in, thicker now with disappointment. By October of that year, 2 years since Veronica had disappeared, the vibrant greens of spring had long faded into the sun-baked golds of autumn. The landscape was brittle, the ground cracked from heat, and the towering forests had become dry kindling waiting for a careless spark. In the middle of this brittle silence, fate intervened in the most unexpected way. Michael Petro, a retired chef nearing 70, had discovered a new passion in the twilight years of his life: hunting truffles. It was, in many ways, the perfect pursuit for a man who had spent decades crafting gourmet meals. Now, instead of plating delicacies, he searched for them at their source. His partner in this venture was Rosie, a stout, sharp-nosed coon pig with a nose more discerning than any truffle dog. Rosie had an instinct for the elusive fungi that grew beneath the roots of ancient oaks. That morning, Michael and his wife, Sarah, had driven their dusty old pickup deep into a remote corner of Napa County, far from public trails. They had access to a sprawling private ranch, granted by the owner who respected Michael's care for the land. The forest was cool in the early light, the air damp under the thick canopy. The ground here was perfect for truffles, shaded and undisturbed. Rosie, typically methodical in her digging, suddenly began pawing at the earth with uncharacteristic urgency. She grunted and snorted, sending clumps of dirt flying as her hooves tore at the forest floor. "She's on to something big," Michael called over his shoulder, excitement lighting up his weathered face. He knelt beside the pig, reaching in to assist, expecting to uncover the rough, aromatic surface of a prized black truffle. But his fingers met something soft, something wrong. The earth yielded to his hand in a way that truffles never did. He paused, his smile fading. "Rosie, move back," he said gently, coaxing the pig away as he pushed deeper into the soil. His hands brushed against something smooth and slick. Plastic. A chill ran through him. He dug more carefully, pulling away leaves and debris. Just beneath the surface, less than a foot down, was a translucent grocery bag, its contents obscured by grime. With effort, he lifted it out, the bag heavier than it should have been, its shape twisted and compressed. Sarah approached, curiosity giving way to dread as she saw his expression. "What is it?" she asked, voice tight. Michael didn't answer. He was staring through the thin film of plastic. Inside was a jumble of items, clothing tangled and stained, crumpled into an unnatural mass. A pink and white sports bra, faded now but still distinct in its gradient coloring. Black athletic shorts. A condom, unrolled. Its wrapper, a familiar blue Durex, is still sealed, and something else. A used tampon, its presence unmistakable and haunting. Sarah gasped, stumbling back, one hand flying to her mouth. The moment held a terrible weight. The air, moments before, filled with the earthy scent of moss and oak, now felt suffocating. The world around them went silent, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. It was the bra that caught Sarah's eye. She stared at it, her mind racing. The color, the shape. Something about it stirred a memory. A headline, a missing poster, the smiling face of a woman in running gear. It clicked into place with a sickening jolt. "The runner," she whispered. "Michael, it's her. I think this is hers." Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. "Hold it up," she said, her voice barely audible. "Don't move it. Just hold it up." Michael, face pale, eyes fixed on the horrific bundle, lifted the bag into the dappled sunlight. The autumn rays filtered through the canopy. Above, casting the twisted contents in stark relief. Sarah took a photo, then another. The clicks of the shutter echoed unnaturally through the trees. Sarah knew immediately how vital it was to preserve the moment. The evidence had to be documented exactly as it had been found, before curious hands disturbed it, before nature or human error could alter the story it told. The light through the trees, the exact way the bag lay partially uncovered in the soil, the way its contents were jumbled but visible, it all mattered. It was a silent, terrible testimony, and she needed to capture it in its untouched state. They stood together, Michael, Sarah, and Rosie the pig, still and solemn beneath the oak tree. None of them spoke for a long time. The horror of what they'd unearthed hung between them. They knew instinctively that they couldn't do more. The site was sacred now, a potential crime scene. It had to be treated with care, with reverence. Sarah marked the location with a vivid orange ribbon she tied to the lowest branch of the tree. Then, with hands that trembled, she pulled out her phone and called the sheriff's office. The drive out of the woods was surreal. The silence in the cab of their truck was broken only by Rosie's quiet snuffling from the back seat and the distant murmur of the tires on dirt. When they finally met two deputies from the Napa County Sheriff's Office on a remote access road, their words came out in rapid, jagged bursts. Panic and urgency tangled together as Sarah showed them the photos she'd taken on her phone. One of the deputies, Detective Dave Riley, studied the image on her screen and felt a chill run through his spine. He had been just a junior officer when Veronica Hensley vanished. He'd walked those early searches. He'd posted flyers bearing her smiling face. He remembered the distinctive pink and white sports bra she wore in the last known photo. And he remembered the lone shoelace found a year ago, the only clue in a baffling disappearance. He stared at the image on Sarah's phone. This wasn't just a possible lead. It was the first break in 2 long years of silence. Within hours, the area surrounding the oak grove had been transformed. The forest that had hidden its secret for so long was now a hive of activity. Crime scene tape cordoned off a wide perimeter. Law enforcement vehicles lined the narrow access road. Forensic teams in white protective suits arrived with gear, measuring tape, flags, and scanners. The bag was photographed, its surroundings documented in minute detail. Then, with utmost care, it was lifted from its resting place, sealed in an evidence container, and transported immediately to the California Department of Justice Crime Lab in Sacramento. The urgency was clear. What had been found was no longer theory, it was fact, and it needed answers. At the lab, under fluorescent lights and under layers of protective gloves and sterile procedure, scientists began their painstaking work. The clothing was separated from the other contents. Each piece was cataloged, cleaned, and analyzed. The pink and white sports bra, even faded and soiled, was unmistakably Veronica's. The cut, the design, the brand. They matched the clothing she had last been seen wearing, confirmed by photographs David had supplied. Attention turned swiftly to the condom and tampon. These were the most promising pieces of forensic evidence. Tiny, intimate items that might contain the signature they needed. DNA, a ghost's fingerprint. 2 years in the ground, exposed to temperature swings, moisture, bacteria, and decay. The odds were not in their favor, but the lab team worked methodically, silently, driven by the possibility that this case might finally be solvable. Then, after days of testing, came the breakthrough. From the used condom, they extracted a full, viable male DNA profile. The sample was clean. The degradation hadn't destroyed it. It was a miracle of forensic preservation. That profile was immediately uploaded into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a massive federal database of genetic profiles from known offenders, arrestees, and unsolved crime scenes. The system began its search, algorithms combing through millions of entries for a match. And then, it found one. The name that appeared on screen was Mark Jennings, age 45, a landscaper living in a modest rental home on the outskirts of Napa. Jennings's DNA had been entered into the system following a misdemeanor conviction for indecent exposure nearly a decade earlier. At the time, it was treated as a low-level offense. Embarrassing, yes, but not indicative of a serious threat. But to detectives who had spent years studying violent offenders, this was no minor red flag. It was a pattern, one that had been building toward something far worse. Detective Riley felt the adrenaline kick in as the pieces began to connect. Jennings was exactly the kind of man who could have slipped through the cracks for years. A loner, no family, no online presence. He ran a small landscaping business, which gave him access to dozens of homes, parks, and trail systems throughout the county. He could go anywhere, blend in with a rake and a truck, and no one would give him a second look. A covert surveillance team was assigned to track him. For a full week, they documented his movements with precision. Jennings drove his beat-up work truck from job to job, often lingering after hours. He dined alone at corner diners. He bought supplies at big-box stores and local nurseries. To a casual observer, his life was dull and solitary. But to the surveillance team, something more sinister emerged. Multiple times during that week, they followed his truck as he drove slowly through areas known for foot traffic and hiking. He passed multiple trailheads, some remote, some popular, with no clear business to conduct. He would idle near the entrances, his gaze fixed on female joggers or lone walkers. His truck would slow almost to a crawl. He never engaged, but he watched, always watched. The behavior was disturbing, intentional, predatory. The detectives were convinced. Jennings hadn't just stumbled upon Veronica by accident. He had been hunting. With the DNA evidence and the growing surveillance file, they now had enough to act. A judge signed the warrant. The arrest had to be strategic. A man like Jennings couldn't be given a chance to run or destroy evidence. Just before dawn, beneath a veil of fog that clung to the low hills, the SWAT team moved in. They surrounded his house, a squat, single-story structure shaded by overgrown trees and flanked by a cracked driveway. The lights went on. Shadows moved behind the curtains. Then, the battering ram hit the door. The battering ram struck the door with a bone-jarring crash, the noise echoing down the foggy street and shattering the early morning stillness. Within seconds, the front entrance gave way, splintering inward under the pressure of steel and force. Officers surged into the small house with military precision, weapons drawn, voices raised in sharp commands. Mark Jennings was found in bed, tangled in his blankets, jolted awake by the chaos. His face was slack with confusion, not fear. His eyes blinked rapidly, trying to process the scene unfolding around him. He didn't reach for anything, didn't resist. He simply lay there, bewildered, as officers placed him under arrest and read him his rights. He offered no protest, just blank compliance. Outside, red and blue lights strobed across the damp pavement. Jennings was led, handcuffed, to the waiting patrol car. His pale face, soft and expressionless, was momentarily illuminated by the rotating lights, a man now fully exposed, pulled from the shadows he had moved through for years. As Jennings was driven to the sheriff's station, a forensic team entered the house to begin a meticulous search. The interior was sparse, clean, and devoid of personal warmth. It looked like the dwelling of someone who lived a small, structured life. Minimal furniture, neutral walls, a kitchen without clutter. But the emptiness was deceptive. It wasn't the physical space that held his secrets. It was digital. On an aging desktop computer tucked away in a corner of his study, a forensic technician uncovered a hidden, encrypted folder, tucked so deep it took specialized software to detect it. After cracking the password, they opened a portal into Jennings's private world. What they found chilled even the most seasoned investigators. Hundreds of photographs filled the folder. All of them were taken with a high-powered telephoto lens. All of them are candid. All of them are women. The women in the images were unaware they were being watched, captured in moments of solitude and vulnerability, jogging through tree-lined trails, stretching before runs, resting on park benches. The pictures were deeply invasive, voyeuristic glimpses into lives that should have remained private. Among the photos were dozens of Veronica's. Some dated weeks before her disappearance. Jennings had tracked her movements. He had documented her routines. His obsession wasn't fleeting. It had been cultivated over time, growing in darkness. In the sterile gray of the interrogation room, Mark Jennings sat like a statue. He was nothing like the predator they had envisioned. With thinning hair, a slouched frame, and a paunch pressing against his shirt, he looked tired, insignificant. But appearances were deceptive. The danger had always been beneath the surface. Detective Riley entered and placed a photo of Veronica on the metal table between them. Jennings glanced at it once and looked away, showing no emotion. His voice, when he did speak, was low and flat. He gave short, evasive answers. No, he didn't know her. No, he'd never been to that trail. He claimed innocence with the mechanical indifference of someone going through a familiar script. Then Riley slid a piece of paper across the table. The lab report. Your DNA was found inside a condom, he said quietly, buried with her clothes. The shift in Jennings was immediate, though subtle. His jaw tightened. His breathing grew shallow. He shifted in his seat, no longer composed. The calm veneer fractured, replaced by a mounting twitchiness. But he still didn't speak. Riley waited. An hour later, the silence broke. Jennings didn't confess in a flood of remorse. There were no tears, no breakdown. Instead, he spoke with chilling detachment, cold, matter-of-fact, void of humanity. He described watching Veronica, following her, learning her habits. He knew the exact days she ran alone, the time she left, the loops she preferred. He had waited for her that morning in a remote section of the trail, one he knew would be empty. He described the moment of ambush, the way she had fought back. The flatness in his voice made every detail worse. She was asking for it, he said, running around in those short clothes, so beautiful. It's not my fault. A man can only take so much. His words hung in the room like poison. He admitted to killing her, strangling her when she screamed and clawed and tried to break free. Afterward, he buried her clothing separately from her body, knowing it would mislead any search. The confession was a breakthrough. But the most crucial piece was still missing, Veronica's body. In exchange for taking the death penalty off the table, Jennings agreed to lead detectives to her final resting place. The next morning, a solemn convoy of vehicles wound through winding dirt roads deep into the Napa wilderness, venturing even farther than the truffle hunters had gone. Jennings, under heavy guard, directed them to a cluster of bay trees hidden in a valley choked with brush and moss. After several hours of digging, Forensic crews unearthed skeletal remains. Veronica had finally been found. The case could have ended there, but the photos on Jennings's computer told another story. Detectives began a grim project, cataloging and cross-referencing each image with open missing persons cases. Faces were matched, outfits were analyzed, backgrounds were geotagged and compared. One image showed a young woman with a backpack adorned with a sea turtle keychain, an exact match to a 22-year-old college student who had vanished 5 years earlier while walking her dog in a Sonoma County park. Another image featured a woman wearing a silver hoop earring, later identified as belonging to a woman reported missing the year before that. The horrifying realization settled in. Jennings wasn't a one-time killer. He was a predator, a serial stalker who had prowled the hills of Northern California for years. He hunted in plain sight, blending into his surroundings with a rake in hand and a quiet smile. His computer was a trophy room, each photo a record of obsession. News of his arrest and confession spread quickly. In Veronica's home, her family gathered as detectives delivered the final word. The search was over. The waiting, the wondering. It was done. But the relief came with a heavy price. Mark Jennings was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would never walk free again. But for Veronica's family, and for the families of the women still missing, it wasn't justice. It was closure without comfort. An ending, but not peace. The communities of Napa Valley reeled. Jennings had not been a stranger. He was a neighbor, a quiet man with a service truck and a polite nod. And all the while, he had been stalking their trails, turning places of serenity into stalking grounds. The woods, once safe and sacred, now bore scars that time might never fully erase. Female joggers and hikers who had once moved freely through the shaded trails of Napa now walked with a palpable shift in posture, a subtle vigilance in every step. The solitude that had once felt healing now carried an undercurrent of caution. Eyes darted over shoulders, ears tuned to every rustle in the underbrush. The memory of what had happened to Veronica Hensley lingered like a shadow, etched into the dirt paths and tree-lined corridors of the region's most beloved parks. The case sent tremors through the community, not only because of its gruesome resolution, but because of what it revealed. That danger had lurked so close, so quietly. It became more than a tragedy. It became a catalyst. As the shock settled, grief gave way to urgency, and public demand surged like a tide. Town hall meetings filled beyond capacity. Residents voiced their fears, their frustrations, and their deep desire for change. Parents demanded greater safety for their children. Runners shared stories of encounters they had once brushed off. The community wanted answers, but more than that, they wanted action. The Napa County Parks Department responded swiftly. Ranger patrols were increased, particularly in the high-traffic areas like the CH/NH 500, a trail forever linked to Veronica's name. Teams were dispatched to trim dense vegetation along trail edges, improving visibility and reducing the number of blind corners and concealed spots. But beyond the immediate fixes, the community wanted modern safety measures. A campaign was launched to install solar-powered emergency call boxes at trailheads and along select routes. These sleek, weatherproof towers stood like sentinels, providing a lifeline to anyone in distress. At CH/NH, the first call box bore a small plaque, in memory of Veronica Hensley. In those months following the conclusion of the trial, as the news coverage faded and the courtrooms emptied, Veronica's loved ones turned inward to mourn. A private memorial service was held in a sun-dappled garden not far from her childhood home. Her family and closest friends gathered in quiet reverence, sharing stories of a woman whose life had radiated energy and compassion. They remembered her laugh, the way it would erupt in quick, bright bursts. They spoke of her commitment to her patients, her ability to make anyone feel seen, and her quiet resilience. They honored the athlete, the sister, the daughter, and the friend. But grief, as the family understood, was not theirs alone. Veronica's story had become a part of the community's fabric. People who had never met her had joined searches, shared flyers, and run in her honor. The local running club she had helped mentor partnered with her family to raise funds for a lasting tribute. That tribute became a polished stone bench, engraved with her name and the words, "Run Free, Veronica." It was placed at the CH/NH trailhead, facing the path she had loved most, where her story had begun, and where it would always remain. And yet, the resolution of her case could not be told without acknowledging the almost impossible chain of events that led to it. Justice came not from cutting-edge technology or even relentless detective work. It began with a pig named Rosie. Had Michael Petro not chosen that secluded stretch of forest that October morning for his truffle expedition, had Rosie not become inexplicably fixated on that particular patch of earth, had Michael and Sarah not recognized the gravity of what had been unearthed and acted with care and urgency, then that bag, so delicately wrapped in plastic, might have stayed buried for decades. It's unsettling to realize how close the truth came to remaining hidden. Jennings, undetected, could have continued his predatory path. His compulsion fed by secrecy. His victims would have remained unknown. The community would have kept jogging past him, unaware. But fate, in this rare case, intervened in the most humble form. A pig with an exceptional nose, guided by instinct and rooted in the earth. Rosie hadn't found a truffle that day. She'd found the truth. And in doing so, she unearthed more than a clue. She unearthed the ending to a story that had nearly gone forever untold.